Welcome to Plant Your Seed. I'm your host, Fred Ferris. On each episode, we share stories of how ordinary people have transformed their lives. Each story is compassionate, each story is authentic, and each story is a transformation. Here are the stories of the people who are changing our world by transitioning to a plant-based diet. Today on Plant Your Seed, joining us from Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, we have Ben Hagerty. Ben is an essayist and travel writer for the website It's Brie and Ben, which he co-founded with his wife, Brie Nemiroff. Since 2017, he and Brie have visited and written about vegan businesses in more than 60 destinations throughout Canada and the U.S. Welcome, Ben.
Thanks, Fred. Thanks so much for having me, and it's great to be here talking to you from the ancestral homeland of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples and their communities.
Thanks so much for being here on Plant Your Seed. There's so many interesting pieces to your story, but let's start with your vegan journey. How and why did you transition to a plant-based diet?
Depends on when you want to start. It's somewhat began in the 90s when I was a kid. So I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area during that decade, and the counterculture movement in Berkeley and the other communities around San Francisco definitely were present where I was growing up. Like, I did know vegetarians and those who did abstain from meat, but veganism in and of itself was still very rare, and it was still seen as this niche other community or this niche other way of living. And I was, as a kid, like, I knew it was there and I was interested, like, I found it interesting, but I never really pursued it all that much. And it wasn't really until the 2000s, when I was going to high school and college, when I started meeting more people who were vegetarian, that I began to realize that, oh, there's something very fascinating here and all that. But again, I never really gave it much serious thought. And I should say, too, though, it was like I was kind of primed to go into vegetarianism anyway, because I was always that kid who liked veggie burgers and black bean burgers and things like that over beef. But I did eat animal products back then, just because that was just the norm. But I was always like, hey, anytime I can get a salad or just something that's like veggie based, that always tasted great to me.
Mm.
So fast forward to 2015, and by this time I graduated my undergrad. I was living in Los Angeles with my then girlfriend, now wife, Brie, who's the other half of my website, which we can get into later. And we'd always been like environmentally conscious. So like we're always like thinking of like what we're eating and how these things, like how our actions do affect the planet. But we didn't really connect that with food in depth. But it was actually by happenstance when we encountered the vegan philosophy and started incorporating that in our lives. Just 1 week in October of 2015, we realized that we went in a whole week without eating meat. We realized we hadn't eaten any beef or chicken that week, and no fish. And we both looked at each other at the end of the week, and we just realized, like, hey, actually, we realized that this had happened, and we just looked at each other and said, hey, we haven't had any meat all week, but I feel great. Do you feel great? And I said, yeah, I feel great too. So it was like we felt a little more energetic, actually. We just felt more a little spry in our step that week by the end of it. So from there, we just thought, hey, maybe veganism has kind of been around us, and it's been talked about in media. Maybe there's something to it. Maybe we'll feel better if we kind of pursue this lifestyle. And so we set out to do that, but we didn't do it cold turkey. We wanted to kind of learn how to do it as time progressed. So what we did is we first abstained from like red meats, and didn't decided like 1 week not to have any of that. And then after a while, didn't have a craving for it anymore. Didn't want to eat it, so never had it since then. And then the week after that, we would abstain from chicken and just kind of wean off of that gradually. And same went for fish and eventually for dairy. And after months and a couple of years, we found that we just didn't have an appetite for animal-based products anymore. It wasn't that, and that's one common thing I think people, especially I hear all the time, is just like, yeah, but don't you miss this thing after a while? Don't you want that? And the answer is like, no. If you do it gradually and or stay kind to yourself and not punish yourself in like exploring the plant-based diet and eventually a vegan diet, then you'll find it's actually a very inspiring experience and also a very tasty experience. And you'll find that there's so many options that are either comparable or I think even better in taste and flavor than the animal option that was there. So yeah, it was we entered the vegan lifestyle just quite by happenstance in 2015, and it's been great ever since.
Now, what was the total time that it took you to transition?
Good question. From what I can recall, I wasn't taking notes exactly on the time. I was like, okay, last egg on this date. But I would say of by the start of our road trip, 2017, across Canada and the US, that's when we were definitely vegan. I know we stopped into some vegetarian restaurants. There might have been some cheese and like some elements there, but we were very, very much looking for, okay, where's the vegan option? And we were avoiding dairy and animal products at that time.
You know, a lot of times people can go cold turkey like myself, or they transition over a couple of years. And I was
Yeah.
just wondering on the timeline, as far as your why did you decide to go vegan? As far as, was it for the animals? Was it for the environment? Was it for all of these things?
Great question. It was a little all the above, actually. I mean, the initial action of like the impetus was definitely that 1 week where we didn't eat any meat, and then realized we felt really good, and then
And you didn't die of protein deficiency.
oh, I know. I looked like, Bree, I think my blood is still red. I think I'm okay. So that was, I would say, it was the health factor and just feeling good, the energy and the benefits of that were, I think, the impetus for both Bree and I to start going into that lifestyle in 2015, like I mentioned. But there were other factors that I started learning about then, and I'm still learning about now, that I think are just as important as well. I always looked at veganism not just as a diet, but also a lifestyle and a philosophy. And it's one that is intersectional, meaning that it really relates to a lot of things, and you can apply it to a lot of different subjects. So when I was doing it for health reasons, I also noticed, like, hey, this also has an environmental benefit as well. And it really lends to people thinking about stewardship, like basically not using too many resources of the planet, actually taking care of the planet through that. So it puts people in that mindset. And I thought, this is great. Okay, I'm already of an environmentalist mindset anyway. I think this is a great way to think about it. So I applied it to that. And just as years went on, too, I noticed that it could be applied to as a framework to looking at certain social issues and also cultural issues as well, and also even some scientific frameworks as well that I thought were great. So really, the thing that makes me keep going into it is just the fascination of all of the above. Of that, it's just a wonderful philosophy to kind of look at the world in and to approach certain problems in, and that's what kind of brought me deeper into it and made me keep looking at it, and also, and we can go into it later, but also made me think about my grad school project in that way too.
I mean, it's a very deep rabbit hole, right? We
Yeah.
all know that when you get into this lifestyle, that it's very big, and you just try to do the best you can, because obviously a lot of times you don't have the information and you don't have all of the facts to make quality decisions. How does veganism embody a holistic philosophy across ethical, environmental, and health dimensions?
Great question. As I mentioned in my grad school project, it's holistic in the fact that it's rooted in one phrasing or one principle, which is doing the least amount of harm for the most amount of good, or at least trying to do that in certain regards. Like even if there are in situations in which you make a decision and there is some harm or something like that, you're at least trying to make a decision or course of action that will render the least amount of it. So in that regard, veganism, like if you apply it to a cultural aspect, now
Mm-hmm.
not all cultures are the same, and there are different ways to look at it, but um, in certain contexts, like you can look at veganism as a way of, and some societies have done this, or communities have done this, where they actually use veganism as a framework for encouraging cultural practices. And in my research, I noted like some African American communities in the Deep South actually cook vegan and hold vegan meals nights like in their community to promote their recipes and their cuisine, and to make sure that like industrialized and say like settler corporations don't influence that too much, so that it kind of becomes a way for them to practice that and keep that. And in other cultural scenarios, like in Judaism, actually there have been quite a few rabbis who, like more than 70 rabbis in the past couple of years, who have stated like, yeah, veganism and maintaining that lifestyle actually is a great way to stay to kosher. So looking so in those frameworks, it's definitely lends to wanting to promote and be kind to different cultural environments and different communities. And unfortunately, I think a lot of people would kind of forget that. Like they look at the media and how veganism is portrayed there. It's always like elitist and expensive, and if I should say, like very white. But in my research and just in my experience, it actually is a philosophy that lends people to be able to explore their cultures in a deeper way and to reinforce certain behaviors and exercises that may be very important to them. So then the ethics side, again, to do the least amount of harm or greatest amount of good, you can see that just in the principle. Like the reason why many people would even start thinking about eating a vegan diet would be to, aside from like health benefits, which I mentioned, which are very prominent, they're also thinking, as I do, that it'll render less harm to their environment and less damage to like the food systems and the other living things that are around them. These are typically people who are thinking that they want to do good, and they're thinking about how every behavior affects that. And not all. I always say that it's not a monolithic experience, but yeah, from an ethics standpoint, I think it just lends and helps people who want to experience and do good and to render the least amount of harm in their decisions, and helps them to be able to find ways to do that.
One of the things that I'm always curious about is how people align their values with their actions. And that's kind of what I'm getting at.
Mm-hmm.
What did it feel like for you when you were able to finally align your values with your actions?
It was, well, there's never like an epiphany or a realization where it's just like, oh, my ethics are universally like perfect now.
Right,
I will
sure.
say that. I think it's an experience and an ongoing journey in doing that. And veganism principles that I just mentioned lend to, or are a conduit to kind of experiencing and doing it that way. But I think it was really as I was just learning more about the philosophy, because like I love the lifestyle, but I'm also a very academic, just naturally an academic person. I like to study and look into things in a deeper mindset or in a deeper way. And I think it just as when I made the connection that this philosophy can be applied to many different aspects in life, like I mentioned before, cultural and socioeconomic and science, etc. That's when I realized, hey, you know what? This is not just something I can practice at home. This is something that can be applied to a great many structures, many institutions that can do a lot of good, potentially do a lot of good as well. So, I mean, like I said, not an exact moment, but it was, I think it was really while I was doing my research project when I realized just how multifaceted it was, how intersectional it was. And so, like in the past 3 years, I knew that it could do a lot of good for travelers and for those who wanted to travel ethically and kindly. That's why we created the website when we did in 2019. But it was just like a year or two after that when I realized, hey, this can go beyond that.
Let's get to your website. Now, you guys traveled across Canada and the US in 2017, 2018, and kind of created a blog page or a website that encompasses that. So what was some of the things that you found to be interesting along your travels?
So things that I found interesting on the travels, and I can get into the details later, like where we went exactly. But what was most interesting to me is that, one, it debunked actually a lot of assumptions I had made about veganism in that regard. So when we started the trip, I thought vegan businesses and vegan ways of life would got to be the most I should say, sustainable, and like there'd be more vegan stuff on the coasts in the more affluent cities and all that. But what was a pleasant surprise was that I found vegan communities, like vegan businesses and vegan inhabitants throughout Canada and the U.S., even in places we wouldn't think that they were there, such as like, well, I don't mind saying this, nothing against the Midwest, but I actually was surprised by how many vegan businesses and how many vegans I encountered in the Midwest of the United States, just because the media and the I should say the cultural portrayal of that region is that it loves meat, loves dairy, and it won't ever give that up. But when we got to places, when we got there, like in say like Kansas City, I found quite like half a dozen vegan businesses at the time that were in existence there, and it was a very niche, very small community, but it was full of people who really were engaged with it and took it seriously. And I was just surprised not only that there was so much there, but that it was a flourishing community that was really sustaining itself and all that. And the second one that I found fascinating was that I was surprised how vegan philosophy was experienced in so many different ways. I mean, the philosophy is like that, it's just like doing the least amount of harm for most amount of good. But the way that people thought about that and exercised it was very much based on their environment. And I found that riveting. It was one of the reasons why it led me to my grad school project. Case in point was we met up with a guide in Santa Fe in New Mexico, and I didn't see too many vegan restaurants, like proper vegan restaurants there at the time. And again, things have changed now since this was 2018, and who knows what's changed since then. But at the time, I noticed there weren't that many, and so I asked our guide there. I was like, "Yeah, I noticed that many, but it's allegedly a very prominent vegan destination. So I'm just curious, like, what is it there?" And the guy told me that, oh well, veganism. Those who are vegan here consider it more of an at-home practice, like a holistic domestic thing that they like to practice indoors. People cook a lot, and they like to experience it at home and with their neighbors and all that. So it hasn't really branched out outside of that context just yet here. And just like, there'll be vegan business eventually, but for now it's kind of considered a domestic experience. Domestic not meaning like labor or anything, but like domestic meaning like in the home. And I was just like, oh, that's riveting. Like,
yeah, that's fascinating.
Yeah, that kind of homestead cultural environment that was kind of going on there was being applied to the practice of veganism in that regard. And I found it fascinating. Now again, it's a large city, so it's like it's not specifically that, but that experience I found was that testimony was very fascinating to me as it was just brought up, and it's kind of stuck with me ever since. And it led to me realizing that there are many different experiences of this philosophy, depending on their environment and the person themselves.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I've been to Kansas City, and it is kind of surprising. It's a cafe gratitude there that is just seems very strange to be there.
Yeah,
I think it's a West Coast thing. So, what gave you the idea to create your website?
That kind of lends back to the reason why we went on our road trip in the first place. If I can go back to that, that one can understand why we did it. So in 2017, my then girlfriend, now wife Bree, and I, we got married, and we were thinking about what to do for the next couple months for our honeymoon. We were both working remotely, so we were thinking about doing an extensive one. So like take some couple weeks vacation and then work for a little bit in the destination, and then just kind of keep exploring. We did a cost-benefit analysis and realized that living in Los Angeles, where we were at the time, was more expensive than doing a road trip for the same amount of time. So we realized what that means is it was less expensive to do a road trip across the Canada and the U.S. and travel in a Prius and stay at Airbnbs than it was to have an apartment in Los Angeles for that same amount of time. And so we both we always look at each other going, what? Another one of those moments. And we just thought, okay, you know what? We've always wanted to do a road trip, and this would be great. At the same time, Bree was working for a vegan publication. She was writing a lifestyle and business call for it, just like featuring business, kind of like what we're doing now in a way. It was like featuring businesses and talking about what's going on there. And she thought this was also a great way to add content to it. And I was a travel agent at the time, and like I said, working remotely, so that I was still working 9 to 5, but I could travel on the off hours and drive us to where we needed to go, and we'd spend. So we thought, like, hey, let's do that. Let's pull our stuff in storage, save some money that way, go across Canada and the U.S., go to these places we always wanted to been to. We'll get some content for her magazine, and I'll just keep working 9 to 5 and experience the restaurants and places that she was going to write about on my off hours. So that's what we're doing. So from 2017, 2018, when we were doing that, we were gathering a bunch of content that was for her publication at the time. And at that same time, I was also getting inspired, hearing stories like I just told you before, like Santa Fe, which was just how and why these entrepreneurs were going into these businesses, in the vegan business, and what their experience was like in each city that they were in. And I just was fascinated with there. I was taking notes on it and again, I was just thinking, like, oh, this would be kind of cool to visit someday. Maybe something will come out of it. And soon after we got back from our travels, Bree left her publication, but we still had some content that was still legally ours, and we still wanted to write about, and I still had those ideas from those notes too. So we thought, you know what? There are a lot of people who wanted to do what we just did, maybe not like months-long vacations or trips, but those who were thinking about going to these places like Kansas City, like I mentioned, or Chicago, or just places that had been or that are not along the coast and don't have a reputation of being vegan friendly. There are a lot of people who would love to go into these places, but don't consider it just because it has those reputations. But when our trips reveal that they do have vegan friendly options. And so we thought, wouldn't it be great to create a resource that would allow people to not just follow our journey, like I mentioned at the top of the podcast, like not just follow us, but to have guides and have other resources and provide outlooks and ways of thinking that would actually help them have great times in destinations they never even considered if they wanted to vegan lifestyle. And that's where It's Bree and Ben came along. So, and by 2019, we got that started, and it took a little while to figure out how to do a website because we never designed one before. So 2018 was a very big learning year into 2019. But by that year, got the website up and running. And the premise was, and still is just creating content that others can use to not just plan their trips and knowing what's there, but find ways to travel kindly. And by that is how to think about when you visit a space, how to behave and think about and still enjoy yourself with the knowledge that you're visiting someone's home. And what does it look like when you're traveling and being a guest ethically in someone's home in a city? Also, how to be kind to yourself. For example, we have an article that I quite like that is about how to travel as an introvert, and knowing that, you know, it's great to experience all these things outside and you want to get as many tours in and you want to do all these activities as much as you can, but your energy level might get zapped earlier than you expect. And how to be just more mindful of your energy levels and what you enjoy as you do that. So like we create a guide that says like, hey, after you do an activity, make sure you take some time to rest and then enjoy coffee or have a nice quiet lunch, and schedule in time to read in between your activities. So that kind of stuff. And the feedback has been very good, and we are continuing to do content. We have some more guides coming up, and yeah, it's been a wonderful experience so far.
So who is the introvert? You or Bree?
That's best. I've been told by different people I give off a lot of extroverted energy and a lot of introverted energy. So I really don't know how to answer that for myself. I would say I'm kind of a solid mix there. I did take a personality test years ago, but it was like twice, and it kept getting different answers. So I can't speak actually on that.
Yeah, you just never know with those, right? Some days you feel like this, some days you feel like that. So you just can never tell with those personality tests. Mm-hmm. What did you learn from traveling across the country that you can tell us about?
So aside from the lessons I told you before, like the social and the business aspect of vegan businesses in different cities, think for us personally, it was that we learned that how inspiring and fun veganism could be, not just in cooking at home, but just how it led to meeting wonderful people along the way. That's the thing. There were so many wonderful people in the vegan community that we met through that. Either they're business owners or guides or just people we were staying with who all shared something in common, which was nice, which is just a positive outlook on, or at least a inclination to be empathetic and to not necessarily be optimistic all the time, but it was just that they cared very much about the feelings of others around them, and they either wanted to translate that caring into a business or into providing a nice, safe space for us to sleep in and stay in, or show us around in the city. In terms of like difficulty, I would say there was none that was really specific to veganism of itself. Like it was never hard to really find. Well, it's complicated. In cities, there are many meal options like you can find. Like you can generally find grocery stores and things that you can supply and cook at home or dine out at least for a while. But I'd say the difficulty that we found was not due to veganism itself, but just showcases uh, how I should say how broken our food system is. My case is like the cities are fine in which they're getting supply of food, but if you go outside the cities into more rural areas, then it's harder to find plant-based options. And I don't just mean like packaged things. I mean like fruits and vegetables, like the basics, like grains and legumes and things like that, and beans. So, and one I have heard the argument saying like, oh, see, veganism is not everywhere. It shouldn't, like it's hard to be vegan everywhere. It's like, oh no, that's not an indication of that veganism is hard. It's an indication that the food system and the way we structure the industry of food is not equal. That it's, for example, these rural areas actually produce a great deal of these plant-based foods. So like legumes and fruits and vegetables, like I mentioned before. But the thing is that everything that they produce, or the majority of what they produce, is shipped out of those areas and distributed to major cities and other places that want to buy them. So that lends to leaving little healthy food or just nourishing food in those areas that produce the food in the first place. So I did encounter that in specific places, and I won't mention exact places just out of respect, but I did have that realization, and I saw it firsthand while we were traveling, and saying that there really is a very concerning practice going on in which food is not being distributed to everyone equally and fairly. And I do think it's something that really needs to be addressed in just public policy and stuff like that, but that's another story.
What is it about the food system that you feel is broken? What is it that you feel is the real reason behind this?
It's a very complex issue. I should say, foolish to just say that there's one major thing, and once we find the solution to that, then it'll act as a panacea and just cure everything going on. So it is a complicated issue, and also I don't study the food system specifically, so I'm not an academic on it, but I've experienced it in different scenarios. So I'll answer that as best I can, given my background here. And I would say that the biggest issue is that it's still very much looking into profit-based and just a constant churning of just getting consumers to buy things off the shelf, and whatever it happens to be. And a lot of producers are just thinking of not distributing just basic foods for basic needs, like even just like grains and legumes, like I mentioned before, fruits and vegetables, but just trying to say, okay, where can we sell the most of it in these places? And so they're going to put it in areas where they know it will sell faster, or they know that they have a contract that will allow them to do so. That, and also there is a perception especially in media, showing that the foods that are nutritious are either inaccessible or in somehow part of this elitist operation that lends to them thinking, lends to them thinking that anything that might be nutritious could be just either inaccessible or just beyond like the normal person or just like the typical consumer. What I mean by that is just pretty much look at veganism as it's portrayed in media, and I've touched on this before in other articles and writings. It's that a great deal of portrayal of veganism, at least in mainstream media, is that it is, like I said, portrayed as being something that only rich people can get because those products are the packages or the products that they portray are packaged and have an upcharge and look really nice, and the they tend to be on coasts and cities where it's the standard of living or the base cost of living is much higher. And honestly, it's typically portrayed as only being one just socioeconomic type, which is that, and very white. And so I think that it's a combination of problem with the food system and a problem with how veganism and just plant-based eating and just nutritious eating is portrayed, which is that it's just something that's completely inaccessible and that is only marketed to that group that I described. And I think that really does it a disservice because veganism is meant to be kind to all. And that's where the philosophy really is. And there are instances in which that philosophy and just the idea of how you eat and doing less harm while you're eating something is not just unique to the white elitist Western experience. It's applicable. It's found in many different and exercised in many different communities and different cultural environments. And it's definitely not just that one way. And also that if I may argue, some of the philosophy of veganism didn't originate in the West with white people. It originated thousands of years before that. Yeah, it's real. There's just a concerning phenomenon that's going on, I think, in the food system as well. That is also parallel to what's going on in media, just showing that if you want to eat health, like if you want to think about eating healthy, it's really an inaccessible elitist thing that you shouldn't really be thinking about. It just feeds into this weird institution, when in fact it's the contrary. It's really meant for all.
Yeah, that's always something that I guess challenges me when I hear it. When people say that it's a rich, say, white thing, and when I step back and I look at it, I don't see it that way. I see it as the reason that things are, we'll just say beef and cows, things like that, is because of the subsidies, right? So if you made an apple a nickel, people would buy it. And I feel that what they've done is they're promoting unhealthy food at the expense of healthy food. And you could see this in the inner cities, and you can see this whether you're poor or rich. You can see that the food system seems to be broken as far as the U.S. food system and the government and the subsidies, and they give to all of these industries, whether it's dairy, whether it's cattle farming, whatever it is. That is the issue, is the subsidies, because if you change the subsidies to be more healthy foods, then people would eat healthier.
Exactly. Yeah. A lot of people think that, like, take a McDonald's hamburger, for instance, is naturally inherently less expensive because, you get that for just a few dollars. But what they don't realize is it's government subsidies that make that so inexpensive. And there's been research looking into that and indicating that once the subsidies are removed, a McDonald's hamburger is $20 US or even more in certain areas. And a lot of people just, again, don't think about that because the messaging they get and what they see after subsidies and after the marketing that those aforementioned industries have projected is that meat is naturally inherently less expensive, and vegetables are more expensive, so therefore naturally I should just go to meat. But it's only that way because of a government designed artificial system that is keeping that price down. And once you remove that, you'll find that actually by dollar it's more expensive, and by time and labor and resources it's a lot more expensive. And that's one thing I hope that not just local governments, but just governments and communities in Canada, the US, and elsewhere would consider. It's just that there still are subsidies that are prioritizing meat and dairy, when there are a lot of studies out there now showing that these products are not so healthy for us. And I hope in my lifetime, if I were to have any hope for something changing, it's that subsidies do switch and start leaving the meat and dairy industries, and that there are more subsidies placed on plant-based products.
Now, as far as that's concerned, your thesis project was about vegan businesses.
Mm-hmm.
What have you learned from that thesis project?
The project itself is called Ben's Vegan Vancouver, and if anyone who's listening is interested in looking at the fine details, they're on my website there, so feel free to pop over, and it's written there in its entirety. And to kind of answer that question, I just have to explain, give context of what we looked at.
Mm-hmm.
So for that one, I want to explore how vegan businesses in Vancouver explored and operationalized and just overall experienced the vegan philosophy in their day-to-day. And by that, I mean, like, what was it like to be a vegan business there? What were the common themes that they experienced? What were the benefits of it? What were the perceived difficulties with it? What was it like? In the end, I designed the project to be one where I would visit 12 vegan businesses in Vancouver, and it ended up being 6 in the neighborhood of Kitsilano and 6 in Mount Pleasant. And I'd go in there, and after establishing like an introductory rapport with the business owners beforehand by email or by phone call, I would just go in there and kind of experience the places, sample some products there, and compensate them for it, of course, and then just chat with the business owners and managers who were there, and get to know what their experiences were like. And from that, I did learn and detected 4 major themes that I thought were very, not just fascinating to me personally, but also just fascinating for the community and the business community as a large whole, as this becomes more of a significant phenomenon, veganism in business. So the first one was that health was one of the biggest reasons why vegan entrepreneurs went into creating a vegan business in the first place. And it's because of the perception that the vegan philosophy lends to wanting to do and benefit health concerns. Mm-hmm. And so that was something they wanted to get into. Some of them had reported that, like, they had either health concerns with family members or themselves, and they wanted it so that they wanted to create a business and create products that could help others who might be going through the same situation feel like they had something there that could help address those concerns as well. The second one was that a lot of the businesses reported that inclusivity was a main factor into wanting to create the business, and also that veganism lent to creating environments of inclusivity. What I mean by that is, because the vegan philosophy is geared towards wanting to render the most kindness and the most benefit to others, that extends to how people are treated as well. And so there were a lot of businesses that wanted to create safe spaces for those of different genders, and also create spaces for those of different dietary needs where it was very difficult for them to experience it otherwise. But an example of that was a bakery that's no longer in existence, unfortunately, but what was called Fairy Cakes. They had hypoallergenic as well as vegan products. So the idea was that no matter what your dietary needs are, no matter what your tastes are, you could find a baked good that anyone can enjoy without having to be selective and be like, okay, is that gluten-free? Does that have any nuts? Does that vegan? That kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And another one was, I found particularly nice, and that led to this, was one that is still in existence right at the time of this recording, called Cider House. And that was a cidery public house in Vancouver that sells ciders, but the ambiance was very inclusive for different genders. So it's tried to escape the typical trappings and motifs of like a typical bar, which are like dark and a little, sometimes not feeling as safe for some people, and trying to brighten it up and feel very open for anyone to enjoy those products. And Tintory Brows was another one too, where, and that was another business I visited, where they produced eyebrow tints for those of different skin tones. So no matter what skin tone you might be, they'll do their best to try to create a wide spectrum to fit that, whatever you might need. And there are many others that did explore and want to include inclusivity into their mission, and I found that very, very inspiring. The third theme, which was interesting but also a little concerning, was the issue of discrimination against vegans and veganism. even in cities as vegan friendly as Vancouver. The academic literature describes this as vegophobia, and I was fascinated just by some of the stories I was hearing about this experience from the business owners. One of them, who I can't name for out of respect, they said that they had gotten a vegan certification, but they were afraid to put it up in their window because they were afraid someone would actually take it down and come in and start, being, let's say, less than civil. And I was just very surprised to hear about that because I thought I thought veganism was, was popular here in Vancouver and stuff like that. And so, oh yeah, with like certain members in our community, yeah, very much so. But there still are others who just can't stand it, and so they'll do that. And I did recall seeing that there were, like, in other restaurants that I'd visited too, there were customers who would come into a restaurant and then they would inquire, like, "Oh, what's here?" And then they would hear that it was a like all vegan establishment, and they would turn about face begrudgingly and just leave. So they weren't even open to the idea of just trying it out. They're just like the idea that they hear the word vegan, or the dreaded V word, as I call it, and they just do it about face and leave. So yeah, that is a theme that's still there and concerning. I would say it's still just about perception of veganism in media and what people still think it could be. That it's a niche, counterculturalist, elitist institution that's trying to brainwash people. But I think to solve that, we just need to showcase how kind it is and how inclusive it is, and also more importantly, how normal it is. Like, I love it when I see in media, like, and this is rare, but I guess I shouldn't say I've seen it really before because I've yet to, but I look forward to the day when there is like a character on a TV show or in a book who just happens to be vegan, and they're just eating vegan, and they're not like isolated out or like the butt of a joke or something like that. I look forward to that. And I think that would be a great start to just showing that it's just normal, and that it's nothing dangerous. And I'd say this in my project too, that one could describe perhaps this experience as being discrimination, but that I do acknowledge that is a very very charged term, and it is experienced in other groups, and I don't want to detract or belittle the experiences of other groups and who are experiencing discrimination for sure. So I think it's something that said, I think it's something that should be examined over time to determine that relationship or possible relationship between discrimination and veganism. And lastly, and this, interestingly enough, doesn't apply to just vegan businesses, but just business overall in Vancouver, but also many parts of just the world, it's that the cost of doing business and the cost of living are just growing exponentially to a point where it's a great concern. So, and this means like the cost of just basic ingredients, like I mentioned before, like fruits, vegetables, legumes, oils, emulsifiers, like anything that you just need to start cooking is just going up in price. Also, the rent. In certain areas in Vancouver, on average, the rent there increased by 14%. Now, I couldn't ask what the rent was for these businesses that I visited. That was not part of the project, but I did look up the average rent increases in certain areas, and I just could imagine, like, hey, if it's going up that high in Vancouver, like, I can only imagine what it is like on average for these businesses as well. And this is very dangerous and just overall concerning, because it creates a barrier to entry for those who want to become vegan entrepreneurs and start a vegan business. They're not able to enter the market and do that. And it also forces those that are already existing out. And that has already been seen as quite a few of my vegan businesses that I visited. They've left their locations since then. I don't have an exact number at the time of this recording, but I just know that quite a few have left their establishments since I visited them. And so I'm glad I got to see them when I did. Those were the major 4 themes that were really present and came through this project. And I'm really grateful that I got to see them. And the reason why I put them on the website as opposed to doing like official thesis project or official thesis paper was because I wanted those insights to be accessible to all. Because typically in the grad school world, you write a paper and the thesis, and it's put in this like big, the very minimum 200 page document, and then it's put in the archives of a university and pulled out only when people search your terms. But I wanted it to be accessible to all who might be curious about this phenomenon and see what vegan businesses go through. And I just wanted to in some ways just share the knowledge and insights that these entrepreneurs wanted to have out there. And I'm very grateful to them, all 12 of them, for just reaching out, responding to me and reaching out and inviting me in their spaces. And could be more grateful.
That is a fascinating project. I could talk about that for a long time, but let's find out one thing that's really exciting for you right now in your life.
After graduation, I've just been excited to get back to the idea of traveling again. It's been a little hard, because you finish grad school and then you're like, okay, I got to find a job and get that settled and all that. But the idea of traveling again since the pandemic and since grad school closing down, and getting to experience not just the places I'd visited before and not updating the content, but just seeing old friends again in those spaces and going and exploring new ones. Bree and I hope to be traveling in the next year and ongoing to write new content of new destinations and get to continue learning and exploring that phenomenon that we just saw in the beginning, which was just how vegans kind of interpret and business and just see the world. So there's that. And I'm also, if I may say at this point, if anyone is listening to this and they're interested in collaborating with me and they feel like, oh, hey, I have been thinking of this too. I have a project in mind and I think, I'd like to work with you with that kind of thing. Please feel free to reach out to me. My contact and socials will be at the end of this, and I'll be very happy to collaborate and look into potential projects with you.
Now, finally, can you give me one word to describe how you felt before you were vegan and one word to describe how you feel now that you are vegan?
Oh, does it have to be one word? Okay, I'll keep it to one word. The thing is, it's so complex.
Not a paragraph.
Okay, got it. All right. One word before I became vegan, I would say a word that's apt for it would be the word malaise. And that's a malaise just in both body and in mind.
Mm-hmm.
I was curious about the world around me, but I really didn't think of it actively, and so therefore I would think I was in a malaise. And like I was thinking, like, oh yeah, our food systems, there might be something weird there, but I didn't really take any initiative or action to kind of learn more about it. But after becoming vegan, I then kind of started looking at it and became more active, and I would say, a good word after becoming vegan. Happy. I became very, very much happier in myself and in my life after I became vegan, and I still continue to this day.
It's such a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you so much for taking the time. What is the best way for people to follow you and find your content either on Instagram or the web in general?
First, I just want to say thanks so much, Fred, for having me on. And people want to reach out, they can find me on my socials. Our handle is @itsbreeandben, so ITSBREEANDBEN. And our website is itsbreeandben.com. And lastly, if you do want to reach out to us directly, our email is contact@itsbreeandben.com. And if you do visit the website, please subscribe to our newsletters because we have a lot of content coming out over the next year, and we want to make sure that none of you miss it. We have a travel guide for Victoria, BC coming out pretty soon, and we're really excited to share that with you. So once it's out, the newsletter will be a great way to make sure that you see it right away.
Thanks again, Ben, for being on Plant Your Seed.
Thank you, Fred. It was an absolute pleasure, and I wish you all the best.
Hope you are inspired by this story, and remember, it's never too late to plant your seed. Links to everything we talked about on the podcast can be found on Instagram @plant.yourseed in the show notes tab in the bio. If you enjoyed the show, remember to leave us a review, and until next time, thank you for listening.